In this section, we'll look at the beginning of the anti-war movement from 1965 through about 1967. Of course, this anti-war movement affected the politicians who were guiding the war, and the war movement reflected what was going on in the war itself. So you really have to take the anti-war movement with the actual events of the war in tandem. In any event, about the time that the troop mobilization began after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, you begin to see the first real organization against the war. In March of 1965, students and faculty at the University of Michigan began the first of a series of what they called teach-ins to raise questions and discuss recent Johnson's escalations. Some went all night, others lasted 2 or 3 days. People would get up and they'd talk and they'd question. And actually, these sit-ins went on, these teach-ins rather, went on for a number of years in a number of campuses across the United States. The largest demonstration in 1965 was in Washington, D.C., when 25,000 people attended, and they were led by the two senators who had voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, Morse of Oregon and Gruening of Alaska. In 1966, you really begin to see the first large-scale mass campus demonstrations against the war. Students began to demonstrate against military recruitment on campuses, and others protested university research for the Pentagon. And college students even began talking about resisting the draft. Helping the movement were a number of distinguished opponents who increasingly spoke out against the war. They were intellectuals and clergy and professors, and some of the liberal Democrats led the charge. The prominent people included most notably J. William Fulbright, who was a senator from Arkansas and actually had led the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and had led passage of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The thing was, Fulbright had had a change of heart, and so in 1967, as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he began to hold hearings on the war in sort of a way to publicize it as a mistake. Some of the prominent war critics included Robert Kennedy, or the famous George Kennan, who'd written the long telegram in Mr. X article, the famous journalist Walter Lippmann, and the famous author Dr. Benjamin Spock. Most notably, you see people like Martin Luther King Jr. coming out against the war, and also singers like John Lennon of the Beatles. The critics in total complained about a number of things. Some said it was a war for independence. And the United States shouldn't look at it as a spread of communism, and the United States had no right to intervene. We were just acting like a colonial government controlling a puppet government that wasn't controlled by its own people. Others said its costs were prohibitive, and it was such an expense that it was hurting the Great Society programs that they wanted properly funded. By 1968, costs were approaching almost $20 billion annually. Still, others argued that the United States was hurt in the world public opinion. But between 1966 and 67, a number of prominent American allies began to criticize U.S. policy. So it was hurting America in the world opinion and hurting some of the other objectives the United States had in the world. Others point out that the war effort fell on the poor the most. Thanks to college deferments of the draft, more poor were drafted. Also, many escaped service by influence pulling strings. You'll know that the rich white kids weren't as drafted in the same rate because they could afford college, and when they were drafted, they often got assigned better and safer positions. Television played an absolutely critical role in developing the anti-war movement. You begin to see satellite transmissions regularly, and so night after night, Walter Cronkite, the journalist, would lead with the number of dead and wounded, and then they would go actually to a journalist in the field. It's one thing to read a newspaper about the number killed. It's quite another to see all the blood in color on your TV. And of course, television news always looked for a good story, and if it bleeds, it leads, is the old saying. So they gave it big play, and all of this really sort of developed the movement against the war. It's understandable. The images television showed were truly barbaric. These are two of the more famous ones. One a small girl that had been burned by an American napalm attack who burned her clothes all over. And another one was a South Vietnamese officer who found a suspected National Liberation Front Viet Cong fighter and was simply executing him without any sort of jurisprudence or anything. They just shot him in the head. In 1967, the protests had grown even more. In New York City, there were 500,000 people chanting, "Hell no, we won't go." In 1967 as well, in October, thousands of protesters descended on the Pentagon, completely surrounding it. In another very famous picture from the war, you see a war protester putting flowers in the guns of the soldiers who were there to protect the Pentagon. It's important to realize that the anti-war protest was really just a part of the youth rebellion and counterculture of the 1960s. Before, it had been, sort of been, my country, right or wrong, but with civil rights and all the problems and poverty, people were questioning their government. And Vietnam War was just another way to question their government. You do see groups that were leading the new left, like the Students for the Democratic Society, the SDS, also taking a lead in the struggle against the draft and the war. It was the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, that helped coin the popular phrase, "make love, not war." By 1967, you begin to see a lot of different groups having public burnings of their draft cards. And, this was another indication of the growth of the anti-war movement. This concludes this section on the anti-war movement from 1965 to 1967.